Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today we're going to be talking about the best way to produce plastic and oxygen not included. There are 4 ways to produce plastic, but we're going to be focused on the 2 methods to do so, which is going to be the Polymer Press and the Glossy Drecko Farms. We're going to explore 3 different types of setups that you can build relatively easily and compare their pros and cons to help you decide which method you should be using to produce your plastic. Before we get started, let's quickly talk about why plastic is important. As usual, my videos are timestamped, so if you'd like to skip to the tutorials, feel free to do so using the time bar below or the links in the description below. So, why is plastic important? Plastic is needed to build about 30 different types of buildings and oxygen not included. These buildings are going to range from things that are necessary for you to get past the mid-game, such as the steam turbine, the high-pressure gas vent, or the comfy bed for that morale boost when you level up your duplicates. Some of them are not as critical, but you're going to want to use them anyways in order to help you progress your playthrough. And that's going to be things like the transit tube or the plastic ladders in order to transport your duplicates very quickly throughout your asteroid. There are countless other buildings and their uses, so it's critical to start your plastic production early so you can get these buildings online as you need them. Taking a look at the database for plastic, it shows us that there are 4 different ways to produce it, and that's going to be petroleum, resin, nectar, or the Glossy Drecko. By clicking on all the options, we can get to the base ingredient and find out how they're produced as well, so we can use them to produce plastic. We're not going to go through all of these options because these would be on a separate video on their own, but I can tell you that the most common substance is going to be petroleum because this is going to be insanely useful for other things in your asteroid, such as power production and for rocketry. So this is usually the most viable option to default to for new and experienced players. We also won't be covering petroleum production in this video because that could be another video entirely on its own. There's a lot that goes into producing petroleum efficiently, but it's relatively easy to set up. Basically, you're just refining crude oil using the oil refinery. And you can always find a little bit of crude oil at the bottom of your asteroid to help you get started with this. Eventually, you will need oil wells in order to extract more crude oil from your asteroid so you can continue your plastic and petroleum production for power. So regardless of which base ingredient that you choose, or which method in terms of Polymer Press or Glossy Dreckos, let's take a look at the 3 setups that I have here that are relatively easy to build and that you can build as a new player to start producing plastic for your asteroid. First, we're going to be taking a look at the Polymer Press. The Polymer Press is probably the easiest building to set up with regards to producing plastic, so let's take a look at some of the effects that we're going to be dealing with in order to run the Polymer Press long term. So the first thing that we notice is that the Polymer Press produces steam, carbon dioxide, and an insane amount of heat, in addition to the plastic, of course. This means that we're either going to have to cool the Polymer Press or put it inside of a steam room, as you can see here in front of you, in order to maintain it and have it run efficiently long term. This means that we're going to have to employ the steam turbine and aqua tuner combo in order to get it working, regardless of whether it's in a steam room or if we're actively cooling it. This sort of leaves us with a which came first, the chicken or the egg scenario. And this is because both of these methods are going to require plastic. The steam turbine requires plastic for you to build. So you might be thinking, how do you get started with plastic production if your Polymer Press requires you to produce plastic beforehand? So in order to get started with the Polymer Press, you're going to have to make a slightly scuffed version of the Polymer Press setup in order to get yourself started with a little bit of plastic. This is going to look something like this. Now, preferably you'd have this close to your oil biome or wherever you're going to be refining your oil into petroleum, because this will mean that your duplicates don't have to travel as far to deliver your initial batches of petroleum to your Polymer Press. Obviously, long term, you would want this piped directly into your Polymer Press from a permanent storage area, but for now, a setup like this with a bottle emptier is going to work just fine. Also, preferably, you would put this Polymer Press inside of a cold biome because this is going to allow you to control the heat until you can have a much more permanent setup than what you see here. The cold biome is going to naturally cool the surrounding area, and the Polymer Press is going to make a ton of heat. So the heat essentially gets deleted. The ideal setup would be having some sort of metal tiles underneath the Polymer Press and putting a tiny little bit of water on top of the metal tiles in order to help transfer the cooling from the metal tiles to the Polymer Press. This is going to allow you to run your Polymer Press for quite a while until it starts to overheat. As you can see here, there's not much heating going on right now. It's at around 13 degrees. The cold biome is able to handle the heat that is being produced fairly easily. Just to kind of give you an idea of how much importance this water is at the base of the Polymer Press, if we go ahead and delete all the liquid here, the Polymer Press starts to heat up insanely quickly. And before it even produces one more batch of plastic, it's probably going to be overheating. So you definitely don't want to forget having a small amount of polluted water or regular water at the base of this so that it can keep itself cool. Even with a setup like this, you're going to be able to run this Polymer Press for quite a while, probably many hours before it starts to overheat, provided that you have your water down below. Let's go ahead and re-add the water, just so I can keep talking and this is not going to break. And you can see just how quickly it cools back down. So a setup like this is very similar to my metal refinery video, where I tell you to put the metal refinery in your early game in a cold biome, because that's going to help you cool down the coolant of the metal refinery for many cycles before you have to move it to a permanent location. Another benefit of a setup like this is that you can use all of the ice and snow that is being melted elsewhere in your base. So don't be afraid to use the cold biome and the free cooling that it provides in order to set up your polymer press or your metal refineries. Go ahead and check out my metal refinery video if you'd like to learn more about that setup that I'm talking about right now. But anyways, once you have enough plastic to set up your steam turbines, you can immediately move to a more permanent method of producing plastic, or you can continue to run this until it overheats. The choice is up to you. But let's go ahead and take a look at those more permanent solutions. Alright, so the first setup that we're going to be talking about is the polymer press inside of a steam room. Now, the downside to this is that you are going to need to build your polymer press out of steel. So just in case you're not familiar, a steam room is pretty much required in order to progress to the mid-game, because this is going to be your primary way of using the aqua tuner to provide industrial-sized cooling capabilities to your base. If you need more information on how to produce something like the steam turbine and aqua tuner combo unit, you can go ahead and check out my video that I'll link in the top right of your screen. Once you know how to build the steam room with aqua tuners and steam turbines, the only thing that's different from that setup and this is that we're adding a polymer press inside of the steam room. Down below, we have our petroleum, resin, and nectar, which are going to be the 3 ingredients that we can use to produce plastic using the polymer press. Be careful when using certain types of substances in very hot or very cold environments. Petroleum has a freezing point of -60 and an evaporation point of 538 degrees Celsius, so this is going to be perfectly fine to use inside of a steam room that is about 110 and that will rise to about 150 degrees Celsius. Resin, on the other hand, has a freezing point of 20 degrees Celsius, so we won't be able to use this with a polymer press that is currently being chilled. It also has an evaporation temperature of 125 degrees Celsius. So if the resin heats up before it gets to the polymer press in these pipes, it's going to burst the pipes and break your build. So be very careful using the resin. Nectar, on the other hand, has a freezing temperature of -82 and an evaporation temperature of 160. So this is something that is also very easy to use in either a cooled or a hot steam room. Let's go ahead and turn on the petroleum and start pumping petroleum into the polymer press. Now, one of the downsides to this setup is that you're going to need a lot of steel to produce this. So you're going to have to get your metal refineries online almost simultaneously with the steam room setup. You're going to need steel for your aqua tuners, for your polymer press. You're also going to have to extract the plastic somehow from this steam room. So you're going to need an auto sweeper made out of steel and a conveyor loader also made out of steel. The other components like the liquid pipe thermal sensor and the heavy wall conductive wire or regular conductive wire, depending on which one you choose, do not have to be made out of steel. They can be made out of gold or other materials. Basically, you just want to pay attention to the melting temperature of the buildings that don't have an overheat temperature. So the melting temperature of heavy wall conductive wire is 1063 degrees. The polymer press, on the other hand, is made out of steel, but it's going to overheat at 275 degrees. This is more than enough to put inside of a steam room, which is not going to get above 200 degrees. So the setup is fairly easy. We're basically piping in petroleum, and we're venting out the carbon dioxide that is being produced by the polymer press. This is going to be another thing that you're going to have to take care of when you're trying to run the polymer press. The good news is that carbon dioxide can be used for other things around your asteroid, such as feeding to slicksters, which is going to provide you with barbecue meat, or saving it long term for carbon dioxide rockets, if that's how you want to start your rocketry. You could also just vent it out to space and delete it, or do whatever you'd like with it. Carbon dioxide isn't insanely useful, but it might be worth holding on to if you have the means to do so. The power setup is fairly easy. I'm using heavy wall conductive wire here, which is separated from the outside by a vacuum lock, but you can use conductive wire if you'd like. And I'm also using a little bit of automation, so these polymer presses are not running 100% of the time. This is very subjective, and it's going to depend on how much plastic you want to be producing for your asteroid, and also making sure that you don't deplete all of your petroleum if you have a limited amount of it. Once you have the plastic produced inside of your steam room, you're going to have to extract it somehow. This is going to be another downside of producing the plastic inside of a steam room, is that it's going to come out very hot. Let's turn on the auto sweeper and watch it come out the other end. The plastic that is being dropped is 101 degrees Celsius. That is very hot. You definitely do not want to be building ladders or transit tubes out of plastic that is this hot, because this is going to heat up your base very, very quickly. So before we use it for anything meaningful, we're probably going to want to cool it. And that's another reason why you're going to need an aqua tuner. This aqua tuner is currently cooling the steam turbines up above using conductive panels, and it's also cooling this block of metal tiles, which is very cold right now, and that's going to help us cool the plastic so we can use it somewhere else in our base. This is also a relatively easy setup, but it's going to require your colony to have mechatronics engineering, which is a very high skill, and you're going to need 5 skill points allotted to 1 duplicant in order to set this up, not to mention all of the metals that you're going to need to build this. Other than that, the setup is very easy. All we're doing is running a conveyor belt through the cooled metal tiles and stopping it with a conveyor rail thermosensor at the end that is connected to the chute if the temperature is above 10 degrees Celsius. This sensor will only send a green signal if it's below 10 degrees, and it will allow the plastic to drop out of the chute. So in a base of your own, you can probably have these conveyor rails connected. You don't need the auto sweeper in between, but this is just set up so I can demonstrate what I'm talking about for the tutorial. So the plastic is going to travel through the conveyor rail, and as it does so, it's going to cool rapidly to our desired temperature, after which we can use it elsewhere in our base for something more meaningful than having it sitting around. If your base is very hot, this will also provide some amount of ambient cooling, but that's only going to be a one-time thing because after the plastic matches the ambient temperature of your base, it's no longer going to be cooling it. Once the plastic is sufficiently cooled by the metal tiles, it's going to start dropping and you're going to get very cold plastic. I did go ahead and change the temperature of the thermosensor just so we don't have to wait for the entire rail of plastic to cool all the way, but this is what it'll look like once your plastic has been sufficiently cooled. And here we have 27-degree plastic that started at 100 degrees Celsius inside of our steam room. Once we have our plastic inside of our cooling chamber, our aqua tuner is going to be working overtime. And that, along with the addition of the polymer press, is going to create a lot of heat inside of our steam room, and it's going to fire our steam turbines. We're not going to be power positive out of this setup. There are ways that you could make this more efficient, but this is probably the easiest method that you can probably use if you want to use a steam room setup for your polymer press. Using this knowledge as your foundation, you can go ahead and experiment and find ways to make this setup even more efficient than it already is. And maybe increase your steam temperature so your steam turbines work harder and produce more power, or whatever else you have in mind. But for now, let's take a look at the exact opposite of this setup, and that's going to be our polymer press that is actively cooled instead of being inside of a steam chamber. So this setup is very similar to the steam chamber setup. We're still piping in our petroleum at 95 degrees, but instead of cooling a metal block of tiles that is going to be cooling our plastic, we're just cooling the room that the plastic is produced in along with the polymer press. The benefit to this method is that you don't need steel to build your polymer press out of. Now these ones are built out of steel because this is sandbox mode and I just defaulted to building them out of steel, but you can see that the temperature is maintained at around 8 degrees Celsius, so you do not need to have any of this equipment made out of steel. In fact, you can use gold or copper or even lead. I'm using the same weight plate setup as the steam room, and this is going to be controlling the polymer press in the exact same way so we can limit how much plastic that we're producing. Again, we're still venting out our carbon dioxide. Now the biggest change from this setup to the steam room setup is that we're going to have to deal with the steam in a completely different way than inside of a steam room. In this scenario, the room is already very cold. It's being chilled by the thermal aqua tuner at the bottom in the exact same way that the metal tiles would be. So because of this, the steam doesn't have time to do anything but condense into water or sometimes even ice. So for this setup to work effectively, you're going to want to build some mesh tiles and capture the water underneath and eventually pump it out to use somewhere else. The ice and the water that is accumulating on these metal tiles are going to provide some amount of cooling transfer to the polymer press along with the atmosphere of the room. For this setup, I also have a crude oil liquid lock, so my duplicants can get in and out, or you can use the same auto sweeper and conveyor loader setup as we saw for the steam room. The main reason why we're blocking the duplicants from coming inside of the steam room is because we don't want them to be picking up the very hot plastic and using it to build something right away. We want to send it inside of a cooling chamber first. In this setup, we don't have to worry about that. Our duplicants could come in here and start building with this plastic immediately. It is 65 degrees, so it is still very hot, but it's a lot cooler than having 100-degree plastic. If 65 degrees is still too hot for your liking, you can once again send it through in the exact same cooling chamber that we did for the steam room, and it's going to cool down a lot quicker because it's not starting at a very high temperature like the other plastic was. The purpose of the hydrogen in this room is to help facilitate the cooling that is needed for the polymer press. Hydrogen is the best gas that it's going to be available to provide ambient cooling for your polymer press from the radiant liquid pipes. The radiant liquid pipe contents is polluted water at about 3 degrees Celsius, and that's going to transfer right to the hydrogen, which is then going to be able to cool the polymer press, plastics, all the other equipment inside of this room. So these are your two ways of using the polymer press. Either you're going to have it cooled or you're going to have it inside of a hot room. They're both going to be extremely similar, and you're going to need a steam room either way, whether you use the cooled method or the hot method. But really, it's just going to come down to how much steel you have available and how much you want to spend on this type of infrastructure. Finally, we're going to take a look at the last method, and that is the Glossy Drecko Farm. The Glossy Drecko Farm is my personal favorite way to produce plastic and oxygen not included. I'm going to explain this setup as if you already have a limited amounts of ranching experience, because there's a lot that goes into ranching in and of itself that could be an entire video. So we're going to skip a lot of the basics. But in a nutshell, you want to have a shearing station, a grooming station, a way to feed your glossy Dreckos, and in this case, we're going to be using hydroponic farms with bristle blossoms. The light is the requirement that we have to fulfill to get our bristle blossoms to grow. And of course, we're going to need to produce glossy Dreckos somehow. The glossy Drecko is pretty easy to produce. Your Terra asteroid will usually have plenty of Dreckos wandering around that you can find as you dig. These are also quite valuable themselves because you're going to be able to shear them for reed fibers, which are insanely important to produce Atmos suits during the mid-game phase of your playthrough. In order to produce glossy Dreckos out of the regular Drecko, you're going to want to feed your Dreckos the mealwood plants. This is going to increase their probability to lay the glossy Drecko egg. Once you have a Drecko farm set up where you're feeding them mealwood, eventually your Dreckos will start laying glossy Drecko eggs, and you can move these into a separate farm to start shearing your glossy Dreckos. Now once again, there are many different ways that you can go about setting up a farm. In fact, you might not even need to have a dedicated glossy Drecko farm if you have the story trait, the Critter Fluxomatic enabled. You could just send your regular Dreckos into the Fluxomatic and then directly to a shearing station and then turn them into barbecue. But in this video, we're going to explore a farm setup because they're also very easy to set up early on in your playthrough. Let's dive a little deeper into this farm so we can see what's going on. Obviously, in order to grow bristle blossoms, we have to have some amount of lighting for them, and that's fulfilled by this ceiling light. And probably the biggest thing is that we have to keep the body temperature between 5 and 30 degrees Celsius. This seems like it's hard to do, but it's actually quite easy. In this scenario, I'm using a liquid shutoff and a little bit of automation with a thermal sensor in order to control this temperature. I have the thermal sensor sitting in the oxygen/hydrogen that's right above the bristle blossoms. When the thermal sensor is detecting that the temperature is above 25 degrees, it's going to turn on the liquid shutoff, and it's going to allow cool water to flow back into my farm. Now the water itself is coming in very cold, and I'm just simulating running it through a cold biome in this scenario. Now, one thing that you want to be wary of is that the cold biome is likely going to freeze the water inside of your radiant liquid pipes. So you're going to have to control that as well by either using polluted water that is going to have a much lower freezing temperature than regular water, or something like nectar that is even better than polluted water with regards to its freezing temperature. Regardless of how you choose to cool the water, it's going to be essential to grow the bristle blossoms so they can maintain their 5 to 30 degree temperature. Also, don't forget that your main pool of water should be cooled to around 20 degrees Celsius, depending on where you're getting it from and what type of processing that you're running it through before you're sending it into your blossoms, and that's going to provide ambient cooling as well to your blossoms. Now, the way you extract plastic from glossy Dreckos is by having them in a hydrogen climate. The hydrogen gas is going to allow their backsides to grow, which can then be processed in the shearing station and sheared to produce plastic. The hydrogen is pretty easy to maintain in a room like this. The easiest way to source hydrogen early on in your playthrough is as you're digging out, you're probably going to be able to find pockets of hydrogen that are going to accumulate in crevices such as this one. Now, I just brushed this in so I can show you an example, but hydrogen floats to the top of pretty much wherever it is in your base. So any type of crevice like this is going to be able to trap your hydrogen. In this case, you could put a gas pump right here and either manually deliver it using a canister filler and canister emptier, or pipe it directly into your glossy Drecko farm. In this case, I'm simulating having some hydrogen and I'm piping it directly into the glossy Drecko farm with a gas vent. The beauty of this method is how easy it is. The gas vent overpressures at 2,000 grams. So as long as I have it at the very top of this farm, the gas vent will always prevent too much hydrogen from coming in this room, so my duplicants can safely work in here without Atmos suits. Now, any duplicant that does come in here is going to be wearing Atmos suits just because they're coming from the outside of my base via the transit tube, where they put on an Atmos suit before they enter the transit tube. But you could put this setup directly in your base, and as long as your gas vent is at the very top, it's never going to pressurize enough hydrogen to escape in your colony, and it's going to allow your duplicants to work in here without Atmos suits. When it comes to using the glossy Dreckos, here it is in my super duper Dreamland playthrough, which I've played almost the entirety of it on stream. I have almost 210 tons of plastic on this asteroid just from this glossy Drecko farm. I did not use a single polymer press to make any of this plastic, and I have plastic ladders and transit tubes spanning the entirety of my asteroid. Basically, more than enough that I know what to do with. And this also provides me with a ton of barbecue and lime for my duplicants to eat and for my steel production. Now, I have automation in here that's also going to help extract the eggs from this farm and all the other contents that the glossy Dreckos produce, like the phosphorite. Phosphorite in and of itself is useful for various applications, such as domesticated weezer plants, or for making the pincher pepper nut, which you can use for some very good food choices for your colony. But the main reason you want to have this automation is to extract the extra eggs that your Glossy Dreckos are going to be producing. You'll want to send this into a drowning chamber so that you can convert your extra Glossy Dreckos into barbecue, and you'll want to keep some of these around in automated hatch chambers so your duplicants can replenish the Glossy Dreckos when they die of old age. I have zero automation happening inside of this chamber itself, and I just have the conveyor loader set to extract everything that it finds inside of this room, except the plastic. Then the conveyor loader will take the extra eggs into small chambers where it gets dropped and placed inside of an incubator, and a couple extra Glossy Dreckos hang out here until they're ready to replenish the main chamber of Glossy Dreckos. Everything else gets bypassed and heads directly into my drowning chamber where they get converted to barbecue. From here, they're then picked up and sent into my kitchen. So that's the Glossy Drecko farm in a nutshell. It's fairly easy to produce plastic using the Glossy Dreckos. So now the question becomes, which is the preferred method to produce plastic? The Polymer Press or the Glossy Drecko farm? And to answer this question, you're going to have to evaluate how badly you need plastic on your own asteroid and how much infrastructure you're willing to build in order to get that plastic. The plus side to the Polymer Press is that it's going to start producing plastic for you right away as soon as you get the necessary infrastructure up to produce the petroleum and to deal with the steam and the heat that is produced by the Polymer Press. Don't forget that you can stick this into a cold biome and have it run for a very long time before you need to move it to somewhere more permanent. The downside to this method is that you're going to need steel, and the amount of steel that you're going to need is going to depend on if you want your Polymer Press inside of the steam room or if you just want an aqua tuner by itself in its own steam room to cool the production chamber itself. Don't forget that no matter which method that you choose, the plastic is also going to be very hot, either 60 degrees or 100 degrees. So both methods likely require you to have an external cooling chamber for the plastic itself. You also don't have to use petroleum if you have a way to get resin or nectar, so you can look into other options and bypass the petroleum production altogether. In general, this setup is fairly flexible and fairly modular. You can move this around at will pretty easily as long as you haven't made it into a permanent location yet. If your asteroid has more than one cold biome, which it likely does, you can also move the Polymer Press around and avoid building a permanent structure for it altogether for a very long time. The Glossy Drecko farm, on the other hand, produces plastic very slowly. First of all, you're going to need Dreckos, which then you have to convert into Glossy Dreckos, and from there, you're going to have to wait for their skills to grow to start shearing them for plastic. You also need to feed them somehow, so you're going to need bristle blossoms or mealwood, and some amount of hydrogen gas so their skills can grow. You also have to have a little bit of cooling, but it's a lot less intense than the cooling that's required for the Polymer Press in a steam room or in a chilled room. Another benefit of the Glossy Drecko farm that we've already discussed is the amount of lime you're going to be able to produce from the eggshells and the barbecue meat that you're going to be able to produce to feed to your duplicants. They also produce phosphorite, which is going to be useful for various applications in your playthrough. If you decide to use Glossy Dreckos for your plastic production, it makes sense to start as early as possible. The final positive to using the Glossy Dreckos is that the plastic is going to be ready to use anywhere within your base at around 30 degrees Celsius or whatever the ambient temperature of the Glossy Dreckos and the atmosphere is. There's hardly any reason to cool the plastic that is coming from your Glossy Dreckos. So my final verdict for producing plastic is going to be using the Glossy Dreckos. I love the idea of having my barbecue production already taken care of, or if you already have hatches, for the Glossy Dreckos to supplement that barbecue production. It also helps you produce an insane amount of steel, which is very important to progress through the mid-game of your playthrough. The Polymer Press isn't that bad, per se, because it produces plastic right away. So if you need plastic right away, you can have the Polymer Press in conjunction with the Glossy Dreckos and just turn the Polymer Press on or off depending on your current needs. Especially if you're trying to rapidly expand and the Glossy Dreckos just aren't producing enough, you can of course use the Polymer Press at the exact same time. The main decision for you should be what type of infrastructure you're willing to set up and the resources that you currently have available in order to make either one of these solutions work. Regardless of which method that you choose, let me know down in the comments which method that you would prefer to use for your plastic production, or if you're a more experienced player, let me know how you produce plastic for your playthrough. As always, there are going to be hundreds of different variations of Polymer Press and Glossy Drecko farms. So it really depends on what your preference is. Don't forget to experiment with these setups or your own setups in order to make them as efficient as possible so that you can have the optimal amount of plastic production for your playthrough as you can get. If you enjoyed this video and made it this far, let me know by leaving a rating on this video and by leaving a comment down below letting me know what you thought or if I missed anything that should have been included in the video. And if you'd like to see more Oxygen Not Included content, including live streams, hit that subscribe button so that you can keep up to date with the channel. I always live stream twice a week, usually Fridays and Saturday nights. So whether you're new to the channel or a longtime subscriber, feel free to stop by and say hello. Thank you to those who have been supporting the channel for many months now. Without your support, I wouldn't be here making videos for all this time. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate you coming by and supporting. Until the next video, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.